Hi, my name is Steve Krause, and welcome to my presentation in the on-demand format for this year's C's. Not gonna lie, like everyone else, I'm disappointed because we're once again not meeting in person, but also because of the decision-making process of what presentations were going to be on demand and which ones were going to happen in real time. But we're all trying to make the best of it, and I appreciate you stopping by to see what's here. I've made some adjustments to my original proposal for this format, and I'm going to begin by talking about some of my basic assumptions about teaching online. Then I'll talk about the research I'm doing right now, and finally I'll circle back to my title. What does the shifting of teaching online teach us about access, diversity, inclusion, and opportunity? I've been teaching online and studying distance education since 2006, which is when I started teaching one or two courses a term online as part of my regular load. Besides some publishing and presenting on the subject, I co-edited one of the first collections of essays about massive open online courses, and I also wrote More Than a Moment, which is my single-authored book about MOOCs and their place more broadly within the history of distance education. All of which is to say I've been thinking about this for a while, and that experience has shaped my assumptions about what distance education is and how it should work. I think most people who have been involved in online teaching prior to COVID would agree with these assumptions, but I don't think that's necessarily true with most of my colleagues who have started teaching online during COVID. My first assumption is that none of this is new. Distance education has been a part of higher education for 150 years and has always included both traditional universities and proprietary institutions. As I describe in detail in More Than a Moment, distance education has always made use of the available technologies, first snail mail, and then radio and television, and then the internet from the earliest days of dial up modems to now. Second, distance education has always had problematically conflicting goals. On the one hand, the main purpose of distance education has always been to provide access to those who could not otherwise attend college. On the other hand, distance education has always been a way for both legitimate educators and con artists claiming to be entrepreneurs to make a buck. This tension has only become more complex as many formerly for-profit online universities convert to nonprofit status, and also as many traditional universities increase their presence online and their connection to for-profit providers. Third, decades of research has argued online courses can be just as effective as face-to-face courses. Let's say I taught two sections of the same course, each with the same tests and essay assignments, and one of those sections was taught asynchronously online and the other was taught synchronously and in a traditional face-to-face classroom. If I showed you the essays and tests from the students in both of these classes and then asked you to figure out, based only on those materials, which students took the online class and which ones took the face-to-face class, I am confident you wouldn't be able to do it. So based on what students demonstrate at the end of the course, both modes of delivery are quote-unquote as effective. But there are some caveats about this claim. For one thing, the research suggests that online courses work best at the upper division, undergraduate and graduate levels, because those students are more likely to have the experience with attending college and the self-motivation required to take distance education courses. But the main critique of the previous research comparing face-to-face classes with online ones revolves around the problems of self-selection. Prior to COVID, students, and for the most part faculty, chose to take and teach courses online and were not randomly assigned to them. As a result, it's arguable that the effectiveness of online courses has more to do with the preferences of the learners and teachers who self-select into the format. Fourth, and I think this is the most important of these assumptions, one that is true for face-to-face classes as well, is it's not really a question of what's better, face-to-face or online or something in between. Rather, it's about the affordances of the delivery mode and how both the instructor and the students adjust to the delivery mode. My favorite analogy to illustrate this is to compare the usual options we have for speaking to someone else, face-to-face, via the phone, or via text messages. The mode we choose is usually shaped by proximity and time. We talk to others face-to-face when we're in the same space at the same time, and we talk via phone when we're in different places but also at the same time, that is, synchronously. And we tend to text when we are not in a discussion at the same time or place, or asynchronously. But our choices, or at least my choices, between talking in person, over the phone, or over text are also shaped by the specifics of the situation as well. Our choice of mode is often based on audience and purpose. I almost never text with my mother, and I have a number of friends who I almost never call. Sometimes it's based on the subject. It still seems rude and wrong to text people who about a very serious news rather than talk to them, at least on the phone. Shifting between modes like this happens so often that we adjust to the new mode unconsciously. But if you step back and think about it for a second, the shifts we make are complex and designed to take advantage of the different modes. That's why these cartoons are funny, at least in a New Yorker kind of funny. The dot 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 of waiting for someone to finish their text message via courier pigeon, the therapist patiently busily typing. So my point is that the affordances of the mode impacts and shapes the effectiveness of the communication and understanding. You cannot simply take a face-to-face communication event, like a face-to-face class session or a face-to-face conference presentation, and metaphorically pour the contents of that event into a different mode, an online class or an online asynchronous presentation, and assume that the mode doesn't make a difference. Try pouring a bucket of water into a wicker basket the same size and see what happens. Again, affordances. Like I said, these are assumptions people who routinely taught online before COVID would mostly agree with, but it's not necessarily true for those who were new to teaching online in the 2020-21 school year. In March 2020, when COVID arrived in force, higher education and everything else shifted online to fight back against the pandemic. That same month, the education historian Jonathan Zimmerman published a commentary in the Chronicle of Higher Education in which he suggested we study that moment as a natural experiment regarding the success of online education, since COVID was essentially creating the situation where participants had no choice but to be online. Now, to be fair to Zimmerman, this was in the early days of the pandemic when a lot of us thought this would all be over by the end of summer, so perhaps the window of opportunity for this natural experiment would be short. But even at the time, I thought Zimmerman was wrong. What happened in spring 2020 was that higher education climbed into the metaphorical lifeboats to rescue everyone from the sinking ship of the school year. Comparing that experience to tease out the self-selection problem of previous distance education research made no sense to me. The real comparison would be between thought out and planned online courses with similar face-to-face courses. But by June of 2020, and after a lot of resistance and denial, it was clear that if the 2020-21 school year was going to happen, especially at larger universities without the resources to conduct classes in socially distanced spaces and to constantly test everyone, it was mostly going to happen online, and there were going to be a lot of faculty and students who were going to have no choice but to participate in that format. So faculty prepared to teach online from the beginning of the 2020-21 school year, and the natural experiment testing the effectiveness of online courses was going to happen after all. I had no worries about my classes, and I was happy to offer help to anyone interested in asking about best practices and so forth. I didn't have a lot of folks take me up on the offer, but I get it. If I had been new to online teaching, I wouldn't have asked for help either. After all, I've been teaching for years. I'd rather just figure it out for myself. What did surprise me was how many of my colleagues at EMU and around the country more or less tried to reinvent online teaching on their own. Though, given that this is what happened with MOOCs, when developers thought that they had literally invented teaching online, maybe I shouldn't have been surprised. I thought the strangest choice many instructors made for teaching online in 2020-21 was to do it synchronously and with a software like Zoom. There has been some research comparing asynchronous to synchronous online courses that suggest that asynchronous courses have somewhat better outcomes. But the main reasons why online courses were asynchronous before COVID are because of the logistics and the affordances of the format. First, up until recently, synchronous video communication software was unreliable and hardware intensive, and arguably both of these things are still true for my students with sketchy Wi-Fi and old laptops. Second, the main reason why a university engages in distance education at all is to help as many students as possible gain access to college courses, along with making money by charging them tuition. And offering those courses synchronously would mean a lot of those students could not attend. And third, a synchronous online class eliminates one of the primary affordances of the mode, which is the flexibility to engage in the course on the learner's and the teacher's own schedule. To me, teaching an online class synchronously makes about as much sense as teaching a face-to-face class asynchronously. Suppose I was scheduled to teach a class online and asynchronously, but then for some reason that class was converted into a traditional face-to-face one that met on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 2 p.m. Not wanting to adjust things to this new mode of delivery, suppose I decided to teach the class as if it were asynchronous and online. I'd arrive at the class at 2 because I couldn't just refuse to show up in person without getting in trouble with some administrator. And while there would be a few students there, attendance would be optional. I'd spend the time interacting with students in discussion forums and via email, but I wouldn't speak. I wouldn't refuse to talk with the few students who showed up to the classroom, but I wouldn't encourage it either. Instead, we'd all work silently, staring at and typing on our laptops until 3:15, and it was time to clear out of that room. I suppose I could teach a class like that, but why would I? I did not understand why so many faculty were making the choices that they were making when faced with teaching online, and I wanted to find out more about that. So that's why I started my current project, which I've been calling Online Teaching in the New Normal. The first part was an online survey I began circulating in December 2020 for anyone who had taught some of their college level courses completely online during the 2020-21 school year. I asked people who did participate to circulate the survey to their colleagues as well. Now, obviously, there are some limitations with this research. It's a survey of instructors and not students, and students' thoughts about online courses matters too. My limited version of a snowball sampling did not return the variety of instructors I was hoping for in terms of discipline, and my sample size is fairly small. In short, I don't think these results are necessarily generalizable across all kinds of institutions and disciplines. All that said, I think there's a lot of interesting things to unpack here. 104 104 participants completed the survey. 64% identified as women, 27% identified as men, and the remaining participants identified either as transgender or preferred not to answer the question. Over 50% were tenure track faculty, and 40% were full or part-time faculty not on the tenure track. The last question of the survey asked participants if they were interested in participating in follow-up interviews about teaching online, and about 75 of the 104 participants agreed. I've just started conducting these interviews, and I haven't had much of a chance to do the analysis yet, though the few interviews I have done to date do shed some light on these results. For now, I'm going to focus on just the choice of teaching online synchronously because I think it's a good example of the complexity of these responses. Prior to the 2020-21 school year, about 2/3 of the responses said they either had no previous experience teaching online or they had taught between 1 and 5 courses online since 2015. That's the blue and red pieces of the pie. Just shy of 60% of all respondents said that they taught either all of their online classes synchronously or some of them synchronously. The interviews I've conducted do complicate this a bit. First, the interviews I've talked with so far said their institutions gave faculty flexibility in choosing between synchronous and asynchronous delivery. No one I've talked to says they were forced into one mode or another against their will. Second, several interviewees indicated that their institution had a series of modes of delivery that existed on a spectrum between all face-to-face synchronous all the time and all online asynchronous all the time. In other words, while I wanted to keep my categorizations simple, there was a fair amount of online teaching that fell somewhere between synchronous and asynchronous. Third, and again, this is emerging in the interviews, a lot of instructors made adjustments to their modes, and often after they filled out the survey in the first place. Now, these two pie charts show the choices between sync and async for instructors who had previously taught between 1 and 10 courses online. That's the chart in the left there. and instructors who taught more than 10 courses online since 2015. And it's clear that these two different groups are fairly similar. Somewhere around 50% both said they decided to teach some classes synchronously and some classes asynchronously. 30 to 34% said they were teaching all asynchronously, and almost exactly 17% in both groups decided to teach all synchronously. In contrast, faculty with no previous experience overwhelmingly decided to teach synchronously. Over 3 times the percentage of those with prior experience teaching online, and only about 12% elected to teach asynchronously. Why? Again, I don't want to overclaim the significance of these results, and I think the follow-up interviews I'm conducting will provide a more complete answer to that question. But based on these results and my own observations and informal conversations about online teaching I've had over the last couple of years with COVID, I'd say a big part of the answer is affordances. A lot of people new to online teaching thought the easiest way to pull that off was to teach synchronously. After all, that didn't require a lot of reconfiguring the materials and assignments, especially if by teaching the instructor assumes the necessity of talking with or at students in real time. I also think a lot of people new to online teaching could not wrap their heads around the concept of the asynchronous class. And so what many of these teachers did was a version of my ridiculous example of trying to teach an asynchronous online class in a synchronous face-to-face setting. But even after limited experience teaching online, it seems like most tended to see the affordances of the mode and made asynchronous delivery a better choice. There's a lot more to say about this survey, and I plan to do so in both another asynchronous presentation at the Computers and Writing conference in May, in an article in process for Computers and Composition Online, and I'm sure other venues. But to wrap up, let me turn back to the original question I was going to talk about in the first place. In the call for proposals for this conference, Stacy Perryman Clark focuses on the importance of being here as part of a university community and how our discipline needs to pay attention to the relationship between access and enrollment in order to be relevant in the larger post-secondary discussion. She asks, and how do our practices afford opportunities to both teach and model inclusivity, as well as offer spaces to learn from the wide and diverse range of experiences that students bring with them when they enroll in higher education more broadly and in our writing courses more specifically? Well, these have been the questions and concerns that folks involved in distance education have had since its inception. And the role of distance education in the lives of students who come from disenfranchised backgrounds cannot be overlooked. EMU is a fine example of this as an institution. Roughly speaking, about a third of our student population are people of color, and about a third of our undergraduates and 2/3 of our graduate students are attending part-time. And the average age for undergraduates is 23. So our demographics are one of the reasons why, prior to COVID, we offered about 20-25% of our classes online. There's been some debate on campus about how many online courses we should offer in the fall of 2022, assuming COVID is not a factor really, but it will probably end up being around 25 or 30% of all courses because that's where students are at. So as I suggested in my title, I think we understand what we understand as the meaning of here is critical. I think in the call for this conference, the implied meaning of here is on campus and not online. I understand that. We all want to go back to campus. Most of the students I have had since COVID are looking forward to going back to campus for face-to-face classes as well. And I never want to suggest that we should shift all college classes online forever and ever. But a lot of students who have the choice will want to stay online as well, and we need to rethink online courses not as an inferior mode of instruction we turn to as a last resort. So we need to reassess why we are here, and we need to explain that definition of here beyond the traditional campus experience so we bring education to where our students are. Last but not least, and to riff a little bit on what the great Cindy Self taught us decades ago, we need to, as a field, pay attention to the role technology plays in the teaching of writing at all levels. Self's focus in the late 1990s, early 2000s was on the decisions about hardware, software, and other instructional technologies in education, and how we ignore those changes at our own peril. That has never been more true with distance education and online learning. No one can say what the future holds, but I am certain of three things. We will soon start describing the history of distance education in terms of what we thought online teaching was before COVID and what we thought it was after COVID. That the division between what counts as a face-to-face synchronous class and what counts as an online asynchronous class will become more porous, and despite, or really along with, the strong desire for all of us to return to campuses and conferences in person, the online class and the online conference is not going away anytime soon.